Welcome to the NHL Wraparound podcast featuring Neil Smith, President General Manager of the 1994 Stanley Cup champion New York Rangers, and longtime ESPN NHL veteran Vic Morren. Together, they share no-nonsense opinions on news and issues around the National Hockey League. Whether you're a casual or diehard fan, each episode of NHL Wraparound will leave you more informed. Now, here's your hosts, Neil and Vic.
Welcome to NHL Wraparound. Vic and Neil with you, and this is the third of our 4 summer coolers. We have already done the Atlantic and the Metropolitan divisions, which are available on all of our streaming platforms. Today, we tackle the Central. And Neil, one thing that I've noticed just doing the research on all the teams throughout the NHL, and I'm not saying something that people really don't know, but you really get to appreciate how different every single team profile is.
It certainly is. And if you don't really research it, with 32 teams in the league, you do miss out on what's been going on in the summertime with your team. You might think, well, we're going to be really good this year, or we're going to be really bad this year, or in between. And that's really not the case once you hear what the losses have been and what the acquisitions have been.
There's no question as we get into this. Just a quick reminder that we will go in the order of the standings from last season. We'll do the top 4 teams and then take a quick break. And then the bottom 4 teams, we will point out the point totals and the playoff advancement. We'll talk about the players gained, the players lost, and then we'll hit on some discussion points. So we're going to jump right into this, Neil, and hit the Dallas Stars right off the bat. The Western champions last year, 113 points, took out Vegas in 7, Colorado in 6, and then fell to the Edmonton Oilers in 6. And the players that they have signed, let's start with the re-signs. Sam Steele, Matt Duchene, so that gives them some continuity down the middle, and also Craig Smith, a center. Of the UFAs, they have signed Joel Hanley from Calgary, Matt Dumba from Tampa, Brendan Smith from Jersey, and Ilya Lyubushkin from Toronto. So there's a theme here with defensemen because they lost Chris Tanev in a trade to Toronto. Radek Faksa got traded to St. Louis. He's a forward. Ty Gallandria goes to San Jose. Scott Wedgwood is lost. He is traded to Nashville. Ryan Suter goes to St. Louis. And very interesting that Suter has played over 1,400 games in his entire career, all of them in the Central Division. And also Derek Pouliot, defenseman, is signed by Tampa. And let's not forget the big loss here. Longtime forward, great player, Joe Pavelski, retires.
And that is a big loss for sure. Joe Pavelski's had an illustrious career, and we'll talk about that later on the human side. But the one thing, too, about Ryan Suter that's amazing, he's been bought out now by 2 teams. So he's getting paid by 2 former teams while he plays on his 1-year contract for the St. Louis Blues this year. He'll be collecting money both from the Minnesota Wild and from the Dallas Stars and from the St. Louis Blues. So 3 NHL teams will be paying him to play on St. Louis this season.
Nice work if you can get it. You know, there's something interesting that I want to point out. First of all, about Peter DeBoer, who seems like he is the ultimate bridesmaids coach in the NHL. He's coached for 18 seasons, 7 times. His teams have played 19 or more games in a postseason, yet he's never won a Stanley Cup. And if you look at the last 2 postseasons for them, they go down against Vegas last year. They go down against Edmonton this year. And to me, it always appears that they are the team entering the playoffs that are best positioned to win the Stanley Cup, but then they just don't quite execute at the level needed to get into the final.
And isn't that funny that you're bringing this up now in the aftermath of his former teammate and coaching buddy Paul Maurice winning the Stanley Cup in Florida this season? They both played for the Windsor Spitfires at the same time as Adam Graves was there. That's why I'm so familiar with that. No, but Peter DeBoer just hasn't, he hasn't hit the right combination yet. I don't think it's his own personal coaching, or is it just the player combination? A lot of people didn't think that Paul Maurice would ever win a Stanley Cup because of the way he coached. That was the theory. Well, now they're all, of course, wrong because he's won his Stanley Cup. The same could happen for Peter DeBoer. He's a good coach, just hasn't gotten that exact right combination. You think of it as a combination lock, and you're trying to hit the right numbers on that combination lock to get that lock to open. Well, Paul Maurice found them this year. Who knows? Maybe Peter DeBoer will find it next season with Dallas.
He's going to enter the season with the third oldest club in the NHL. They've got some really good youth that I'm going to talk about, one player in specific in a second, and a good mix of veteran leadership. But do you see the window closing on this club?
I do, in that they are an older team, but you can see where Jim Nill has tried to start to shed some of the older players. I mean, Pavelski and Suter specifically, and I thought Pavelski played great in the playoffs, so I thought he could have kept playing, but he is 40 years old. A big loss for them was Chris Tanev. Not that he's an old player, but that's a big loss for them. He ends up in Toronto. Isn't it amazing that the biggest signing they made in the offseason, Vic, was Ilya Lyubushkin, who got 3.7 average for 3 years, 3.7 million average for 3 years. That I think was the longest contract they signed this summer. So, and they re-signed Matt Duchene for $3 million for a year, just 1 year contract. Who's he's getting older now, but they still got a pretty good lineup.
They do, and I didn't mention Niels Lundqvist was also re-signed. Are you comfortable with how they have replaced Tanev and Pouliot on the back line?
No, not really. I mean, I think that they aren't going to be as good on defense this year as they were last year. I think losing Tanev and Pouliot are big. I don't think Matt Dumba can fill those shoes at all. So it'll be interesting to see how that gets juggled around. And that's a spot where you can't have enough depth on defense, as we all know, during a long 82-game schedule and also especially in the playoffs.
There is one player that I do want to mention in particular, and probably will be the cornerstone of their offense. And for my money, was the best shift-to-shift player in the entire playoffs last year. And I know the Stars didn't make the final, but boy, Wyatt Johnston was visible literally every shift he played. And it would not shock me, fantasy players out there, if he gets 45 or 50 goals this year. I thought he was that good.
Oh, he was very, very good in the playoffs and very noticeable. Like you said, every shift he's out there, you noticed him out there. He was a threat all the time against every opponent, including Edmonton, Colorado. And so he's a really good young player. It's going to be really fun to watch his career.
Plays on the inside, fearless. Goes to the net hard. There is nothing I don't like about this player, and I look forward to him continuing to evolve in the new season. So let's move on to the Winnipeg Jets. They finished second in the division last year, 110 points, won their opening game against Colorado, and then it all went south from there as they went out in 5 games. And new head coach with Scott O'Neill replacing a friend of the show, Rick Bowness, and really didn't pick up too much during the offseason. They did re-sign Dylan DeMello and Colin Miller on defense. Eric Comrie joins them from Buffalo in goal as a little bit of depth for Connor Hellebuck. Hayden Fleury comes in from Tampa, and Logan Stanley and David Gustafson also re-signs. So in terms of the losses, this is where this starts to get a little bit dicey. Laurent Brossoit, backup goalie, he's off to Chicago. But two defensemen rather, that were mainstays on that blue line. Nate Schmidt goes to Florida, Brendan Dillon to New Jersey, and also up front, Tyler Toffoli heads over to San Jose. But making news this past weekend, they traded their first pick in 14th overall in 2022, Rutger McGroarty to Pittsburgh in exchange for center Braden Yeager, who was the Penguins' first pick in 14th overall in 2023. And this is a trade that was forced by the player. And if it smells an awful lot like Cutter Gauthier, who forced a trade from Philadelphia to Anaheim, you would be right, because these two players are best friends. And I guess where I'm going with this, Neil, Winnipeg is a hard team, a hard city to attract players to begin with. And now you've got players that are starting to call the shots and dictating not so much where they're going, but where they don't want to play.
Well, yeah, and it was shocking that one of those teams was Philadelphia Flyers. I don't ever remember anybody saying they didn't want to play in Philadelphia before. I don't understand that one. The Winnipeg thing, if you get an American kid that wants to stay in the United States, doesn't want to be up in Winnipeg in the cold. I mean, it used to be players didn't want to go to the Quebec Nordiques because of the French thing, the high taxes and all the rest of it. That's one thing that's sort of understandable. I don't think players should ever get to call the shots, or else the league's going to break down because, everybody's going to want to go to the cities where everybody wants to go, Florida and New York and so on, which would leave the smaller franchises in the lurch, like Ottawa or Buffalo and so on. So, let's hope this doesn't start to become part of a pattern. These weren't superstar franchise league-wide players like Eric Lindros was back in the early 90s, where he said, I'm not playing for Quebec. I don't want to go there. And he ended up in Philadelphia and had a great career in Philadelphia. Now is in the Hockey Hall of Fame, of course, mostly for his time with the Flyers. And that's why I find it so odd that the other kid didn't want to go to Philadelphia, and he ends up being traded to Anaheim. So let's hope this isn't part of a pattern of players pushing back on where they're going to play.
Before we get a little bit deeper into the Jets, do you see something being written into the next CBA that would prevent this sort of movement?
I don't know how they could do it, because you'd have to get buy-in from the Players Association. I'm not sure the Players Association will buy in on anything that more restrictive to this. The collective bargaining agreement is in place to so that a league can have an entry draft and dictate to the players which team they are owned by. Their playing rights are owned by. Without a CBA, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. It would be, it would be against the labor laws. Everybody gets to pick where they want to work. But when players' union and the owners collectively bargain to agree on certain things and structures, that's why this is allowed to happen. And it sort of breaks down if teams and players buy into saying, well, I don't want to play there, I want to play there. Now, these two guys, from what I understand, didn't say, there are teams where I won't go, other than the team that they were owned by. So they could have been traded anywhere. It ends up, Cutter goes to Anaheim, and this player ends up in Pittsburgh. Not bad places to play, by the way. So we'll see from here.
Still a couple of years down the road before the new CBA comes up. But I want to go back to the Jets now, and certainly a real missed opportunity for them to win the division and maybe get a little bit better of a draw than they got in the opening round in Colorado. They were 44-19-5 on the morning of March 20th, and then proceeded to go 0-5-1 in their next 6. And even though they finished the regular season with an 8-game winning streak, the damage was already done. And as opposed to drawing maybe a Nashville in the opening round. They wind up drawing the Colorado Avalanche. And as we said at the top of the segment with the Jets, they win the first game, although very sloppy, and then just get wiped out after that. And it almost blew away the mystique of goaltender Connor Hellebuyck, who won the Vezina Trophy, but really had a dreadful opening round series.
Yeah. And, Vic, what I find interesting about our talk today about the Winnipeg Jets is if we had had this talk a year ago, we would have been talking about how Hellebuyck has signed long-term, Scheifele signed long-term, that everything is bright in Winnipeg. And now when you do this work that we've done to really take a forensic look inside Winnipeg, and you see Tyler Toffoli, Sean Monahan, Brendan Dillon, Nate Schmidt, Laurent Brosseau gone. And you see who they've signed to replace these guys. You got to think they're going to drop off this year. You have to. And I don't like saying that for my friend Kevin Cheveldayoff and Scott Arniel, but I just don't see it. I mean, they took some tough losses in the offseason.
They still have some pretty decent players in this lineup, though. Kyle Connor, as you said, Mark Scheifele, Nikolai Ehlers, Josh Morrissey, Connor Hellebuyck is still going to have a solid year in goal, but I think where they're going to get tested is their secondary forwards, their middle sixes, Cole Perfetti, Gabe Vilardi, Vlad Nemestikov, and of course, their third pair on their D, which will be, Miller and Staley. They have to support here. So the collective pieces here are good. This is a playoff team, but again, will they be able to make a push up the ladder, or are they going to stay stagnant and go out in the first and maybe second round at best?
Well, and not even looking so far forward to the playoffs, but let's talk about the regular season. At this time last year, it was true. Winnipeg was a contender to win the West. And they ended up being a contender all season long. I don't see them as a contender to win the West. Do I see them as a playoff team? Yes. But I don't see them as a contender. We're going to get on to other teams who have improved over the offseason and who I think might knock Winnipeg, maybe even Dallas, down a peg or two within the Western standings. But I still think those are playoff teams. It's not like they're going to be knocked right out of the playoffs.
They got about $6 million in cap space. Do you see them perhaps bringing their longtime captain, Blake Wheeler, back, who remains an unrestricted free agent?
I don't, because I don't think that the way that Blake Wheeler left Winnipeg, with the C was taken off of him, and then, eventually he was gone and to the New York Rangers. I don't see them bringing him back. There's that old expression, you can never go home. And I'm not sure that Blake Wheeler can go home. It'd be nice for the fans and nice for him, but it wouldn't be the same, I'm sure.
I want to move now to Colorado. 107 points, finished third. As mentioned, took out Winnipeg in 5. Lost to Dallas in 6. In their key signings, Parker Kelly, right wing from Ottawa, Oliver Shillington, defenseman from Calgary, and they also got some support in goal, acquiring via trade Kevin Mandolese, a goaltender from Ottawa. Their key losses, Jakub Trenin signs with Minnesota. Brendan Duhane signs with Washington. Zach Parise and Andrew Cogliano both retiring. So a little bit of depth gone right there. A couple of pieces here, though, that are really interesting from my perspective is there's whispers that after missing the last 2 seasons, Gabe Landeskog is looking to return early in the season. But to counter that, Val Nichushkin is now in stage 3 of the player assistance program and went out during the Dallas series, and the club never recovered. So they're in kind of a little bit of a nebulous situation personnel wise heading into the new year.
Yeah, and the Nichushkin thing was really a shame for the Colorado Avalanche, because at the time they were rolling really well, and Nichushkin was offensively putting up real good numbers. And then
9 goals in 8 games.
Yeah, and then that happened. I mean, Eric Brandstrom, they brought in 2 defensemen for Colorado has come in. The 2 other names that I noticed, Vic, of losses, Sean Walker and Jack Johnson. And the one re-sign that was finally he's getting back to being in respectable territory because he deserves it, and that's Jonathan Drouin. He might have found a home. They re-signed him for 1 year at 2.5. He played last year at 1 year at, I think, $1 million. So they obviously were rewarding him with double the salary. Kelvin DeHaan goes to Colorado to try to bolster their defense as well as Brandstrom. I don't see their defense being as good with those guys, but they did do things to try to make up for the losses, as you said, of guys like Jack Johnson and Sean Walker and so on.
And anytime you've got Cale Makar on your defense, you can't be that bad off. However, there is something to be said here, because supposedly the team did make a pitch on Nikita Zadorov, who finished the season in Vancouver and then opted for Boston. So obviously there is a recognition here that this team, you never worry about them on the offensive side of the puck. They are perhaps the most dynamic club offensively in the league. However, the defense, questionable, and as a collective group, I should say, it's a little bit questionable. But what about also in goal? Is Alexander Georgiev enough? And I thought he played about as well as he could play in that Dallas series, but he's not the kind of guy that I think exudes the confidence that you need to say, hey, you know what? This guy is going to take us to the final and he's going to put us over the top.
Yeah, Georgiev is not Shesterkin. And I make that comparison simply because they were both on New York Rangers, and they decided to trade Georgiev because he could be a number 1 goaltender and he was stuck behind Shesterkin. So Colorado traded for him. And I think he's still a good number 1 goalie, but he's not, as you just said, he's not the kind of number 1 like a Vasilevsky or someone who threatens to carry a team to the Stanley Cup. He's just a competent number 1. But don't forget, the Colorado Avalanche won the Stanley Cup with Darcy Kemper in net. So anything is possible if they can shore up that back end. As you said, the front end is so dynamic, and Cale Makar is so utterly fantastic, along, of course, with the MVP of the league and Nathan McKinnon. They've still got a great club, and they're going to be contending to win the West.
Here's a team that now is looking to contend in the West as well, and I think we're going to have some fun with this one. The Nashville Predators, who finished 4th with 99 points. They went out in the opening round in 6 against Vancouver and really let 2 of those games get away late, games 4 and 6 of those series. But they go out and they made the biggest splash in the offseason, signing Steven Stamkos away from Tampa, Jonathan Marchessault from the Vegas Golden Knights, Brady Shea from Carolina. They also re-signed goaltender UC Saros and as his backup, Scott Wedgwood. And we're going to get into their goaltending situation in a second. They did lose Ryan McDonough in a trade to Tampa. Kiefer Sherwood signs as a UFA with Vancouver. Jason Zucker goes to Buffalo, and Anthony Beauvillier, a UFA, goes to Pittsburgh. So for a team that has typically not really put their feet that deep in the water in terms of free agency, it's a pretty big splash by Barry Trotz.
Yeah, Barry Trotz, who's been at the helm now for 2 seasons, or this will be his 2nd season, I believe, as the general manager, and much, much, much more aggressive than David Poile was ever in all those many, many, many years as the GM of Nashville Predators. David is conservative by nature. I've known David all the way back to when he was with the Washington Capitals back in the early 80s. But they're really going for it. And I'm not saying they're a Stanley Cup team but they're talking Stanley Cup. They're talking high expectations, and they should, because their players are the type of players that can win. Now, where they're going to pay the piper is down the road. When we do this preview next year, they'll be 1 year older, as will everybody, including us. But, they're going to have some other issues to tackle. I think the world of Steven Stamkos. I know some people think that he's getting long in the tooth. I don't. I see him still as the 40 goal scorer. Jonathan Marchessault is a great player from Vegas. Brady Shea, a really good defenseman. Scott Wedgwood will be a very good backup to UC Saros. And as you said, they lost Zucker, they lost Sherwood, they traded McDonough, and they also lost Kevin Lankinen as well. So they're much improved. I think they are going to compete for one of the top spots in the West. I'm not saying they're going to win the West, but I think that they're going to compete for a top spot. And then when the playoffs come, they've got multiple Stanley Cups in their lineup. We know how many Steven Stamkos has. We know Marchessault, what he has. And we know what their captain has from St. Louis. And under his spot, Ryan O'Reilly. So I've always said that the more Stanley Cup rings you have in your room, the better chance you have of getting another one.
Just want to go back to these three signings for a second. So Barry Trotz, really the polar opposite of what David Poile had done all those years. So he signs these three players, Stamkos, Marchessault, and Shea, 16 total years, $118.5 million. And all three of these players are already over 30. And that represents, by the way, about 23% of their entire salary cap for this year. So does this surprise you that Trotz making his mark and swinging for the fences?
It does, because we're not used to seeing those yellow uniforms of Nashville Predators signing free agents. They're a small market team. They're part of the group that is in revenue sharing. They get that part of it. So you don't think of them as the New York, the Toronto, the major, even Detroit, the major market, Chicago, and so, I was surprised, but it's going to be fun though to see if Nashville can compete for the top spot in the league, and then how they'll do in the playoffs. I have a feeling they're going to do very, very well in the playoffs once they get in, because of all the experience they have, and because the other thing, Vic, is that Steven Stamkos has a real bone to pick now. He's going to want to prove to the Tampa Bay Lightning, his family, so to speak, that they were wrong, that they should have had him signed, that they should have kept him there, and they should have kept him there instead of going out and signing Jake Gensel. They should have kept Steven Stamkos, and he's going to want to prove he can do it again. It just reminds me so much of Mark Messier coming to the Rangers, wanting to prove that he could do it in a second place. Now, I'm not comparing Steven Stamkos and Mark Messier at all. What I'm doing is saying, here's a captain leaving his Stanley Cup winning team to go to another market. But you can even tell by his offseason talk how he talks about how we have to raise our expectations. We have to talk Stanley Cup. I love that. I want to see what they can do. And
pretty good supporting cast there already in place. Philip Forsberg, Ryan O'Reilly, Roman Josi, and of course, UC Saros, pretty strong in goal. And I just want to make one more point about the goaltending, because over the weekend, their first pick in 2020 was the 11th overall pick, Yaroslav Askarov, goaltender, who has been pretty highly touted in Nashville, but only has 3 NHL games, when they signed Wedgwood, ticked him off, and he demanded a trade. And so off he goes to San Jose. So, enjoy playing with a potential goals against average of 4. But here's another example of an unproven player forcing a deal.
Yeah, and the team saying, okay, we'll trade you. I think that this is all part and parcel of 32 teams in the league now, and that 32 teams means 25 times 32 as the player base that's in the NHL. And players are, that maybe in a 21 team league couldn't be sure that they were absolutely going to have a job somewhere. Now we're saying, hey, I'm a great goaltender. I know I've only played 3 games, but I don't care. You've obviously don't have me in your plan, so trade me. What I think this guy probably missed was that the Nashville Predators probably wanted him to go down and play every game in the American League to face a lot of pucks. They didn't want him sitting on the bench watching UC Saros every night. They wanted him in a net somewhere facing hockey pucks to get him ready to come up. And maybe he didn't see that. Maybe his agent didn't see that. Who knows? But you're right. There's a lot of this stuff where players think that they should be in the league and want to be traded.
He was going to get an opportunity to fight for at least that backup position with Wedgwood and just opted not to. So still very strong showing in the offseason by Nashville. Let's see how it pans out when we start up in October. So that takes care of the top 4 teams from last season in the Central. And just a quick reminder that our website is NHLWraparound.com. And welcome back to NHL Wraparound. Vic and Neil with you. And we are doing the Central Division for our Summer Cooler Series. And we're going to hit the St. Louis Blues now. And Neil, 92 points last season. They've missed the playoffs the last 2 years, and they've only won 1 playoff series since winning the Stanley Cup in 2019. And I think some of the biggest news from the offseason were the offer sheets that they were able to sign 2 players off the Edmonton Oilers roster, Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway. And very interesting that sometimes these offer sheets are frowned upon, but GM Doug Armstrong says, nobody told me that it was against the rule to do these.
No, and I guess it's much different now than it was in my day, and Doug was around during my day too, but I think there's been 4 stunning things come out in the offseason for the St. Louis Blues. And I'll start with Doug Armstrong picking his own replacement to start next season as GM, and that's Alexander Steen. And that was number 1 surprise to me. Number 2 surprise to me was they actually signed Buchnevich after talking about trading him forever. And they gave him 6 times 8, which is a huge contract. And then they do these offer sheets to Holloway and Broberg, of which Edmonton decided not to match. So they have those 2 players. So those are 4 big news items coming out of St. Louis this offseason, and it looks to me like Doug and the owners they don't want to miss the playoffs anymore. They want to get into the playoffs and make some noise and get respectability back to St. Louis and not be a non-playoff team again for the 3rd year in a row.
This team has some good players, but they don't really have a lot of star power. I mean, they did acquire Alex Texier, left winger from the Columbus Blue Jackets. They did sign Ryan Suter. But there are some real questions here with this club. And let's start with Torrey Krug, who's got an ankle injury, and they're going to be reassessing this fairly soon. But there's a good chance that he's going to miss part or all of the 2024-25 season.
Yeah, and you wonder if Is that the Ryan Suter fit? Is that what the insurance, they bought insurance for the Torrey Krug by signing Ryan Suter because, an older version of Torrey Krug is Ryan Suter. We talked when we were talking the East, we talked about team having brothers on the team. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't they acquire the Joseph brothers this summer, the St. Louis Blues? They got Matthew Joseph and Pierre Oliver Joseph, both of them. So that's really interesting. It's not going to earth shattering. It's not going to put them in first place because of that, but still a fun factoid.
It's not the boat quiz.
They traded Kevin Hayes away to the Pittsburgh Penguins and with a draft pick. Faxa, they re-signed Kasperi Kapanen, 1-year deal. Oscar Sundqvist, a 2-year deal at $1.5 million a year. So, they were busy in St. Louis. They were busy, and I see them much improved over last season with all of the different moves that they've made.
Yeah, and look, they've got some decent players in, as you mentioned, Butch Nevis and Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou and Braden Shen, Colton Parenko, and of course, Jordan Binnington in goal. But there's something about this club that just tells me they're not there with the heavies.
Oh, I don't think they're there with the heavies, but I do think as far as a wild card spot, I think they're really competing now to be in the playoffs, and to be in the playoffs as one of the 4 teams or 5 teams, if the other division's weak, that make the playoffs. Of course, you've got to knock somebody out of the playoffs. And, we've mentioned 3 teams that were really strong last season in Dallas, Winnipeg, and Colorado. I think 2 of them, Dallas and Winnipeg, they're not going to be as strong. Nashville is going to be stronger. I think St. Louis is going to be stronger. And it'll be a fight to see if St. Louis or Nashville, of course, Nashville made it last year, but looking up the ladder, can they supplant one of those top 3?
And don't forget that after Drew Bannister took over for Craig Berube, club responded pretty well, played 11 games over 500. So I think they're a bubble team. I don't know if they're quite there, but if Bannister can continue to get buy-in from this club, then they just may make that push come April of next year. Let's hit the Minnesota Wild. Finished 6th last year, 87 points. Their key signing was the re-sign of defenseman Brock Faber, who was the Calder Trophy runner-up to Connor Bedard. So real key to get him locked up long-term. They also signed Yakov Trenin from Colorado. Jake Middleton they were able to re-sign. But not too much in terms of really big impact players. They did acquire Jacob Luco from the Boston Bruins in exchange for Vinny Lettieri, but relatively quiet for Bill Guerin during the offseason, and some pretty good reason why. This is going to be the last year that they get walloped from the Ryan Suter, Zach Parise buyouts, because $14.7 million or 16.8% of their cap space is dead money this year.
Yeah, and that's, Bill Guerin has got his hands tied before he even starts, and he wasn't part of signing Zach Parise and Ryan Suter to those long deals. So, but he's come in now and has to deal with what he's got in front of him, and his owners know the situation that he's in and the amount of money that he has. He did sign Trenin to 4 years at $3.5 million. And as you said, he re-signed Luco and they let Vinny Lettieri go. They got Graham Clark, Sammy Walker, and Jake Middleton re-signed. So, they did it. I guess they did as well as they could do. They got a lot of 1-year contracts on their books now because they don't have the cap space. So, a lot of guys bought back in at, 1 year and close to the minimum, 775, 800, that kind of thing. And they're just trying to make their way through this final year to get to be able to play on an equal footing with the rest of the teams.
Because that dead money drops down to $1.66666 million next year, and for them, the salary cap's 88, and they're playing on a field of only 73 and change. So it'll be interesting to see how they're able to fare this year. I mean, they've got some excellent players: Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson, Max Zuccarello, and the aforementioned Faber. But this has historically been a mid-range team. They have only won 4 playoff series since coming into existence. 2 of those were in 2003. And I expect much of the same this year.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's going to be a tough go for them in Minnesota, and I think they know that, and they'll do the best they can. They've got some good players, as you said, and some exciting players in their lineup. But to break into that top 4 is going to be very, very hard for them. I don't see it either.
Here's a team that I think has a lot of intrigue, and that is the Utah Hockey Club. So just to give a little bit of background here, they are classified as an expansion team. And when the team was sold in the spring to Ryan Smith, it was kind of a split deal that Utah has all of the hockey assets, player contracts, draft picks, and the hockey staff. Arizona maintains the Coyotes brand, the intellectual properties, and the club history going back to Winnipeg. And when Alex Meruelo withdraw pursuing reactivation of the franchise, which was basically contingent on him getting land to build a new arena, Arizona became dormant. And if at some point the league decides to fold them, then perhaps the entire history and all of the assets of the Winnipeg, Arizona iteration of this club will then transfer to Utah. So there'll be a quiz later on that. But Andre Tourigny, now in his 4th year as the head coach of now the Utah Hockey Club. And I want your take on this, because there's going to be this honeymoon period of playing in a new market. The enthusiasm is going to be exceptional, but they've got some pretty good players on this club. Clayton Keller, they had 6 20-goal scorers. And it's also time for this team to start moving forward.
It is, and I think the expectations will be higher now because they're in a market, a bigger market. They're in they're owned now by someone who also owns the Utah Jazz and has high expectations, and is a very competitive individual. They've made some moves that show. Bill Armstrong made some moves that show he wants to be competitive. He acquired Mikhail Sergachev, which I think was a shocker, and makes you wonder whether Tampa knows something about Sergachev's injuries that they decided that it was time to let him go. I mean, you sort of have to question that, don't you? Because, he went out twice. They signed John Marino. They gave Ian Cole 1 year at $3.1 million, which is good on term for them, but that seems to be a big number. Cole Boydoin, They signed him. And then an interesting one was Jerome McGinley's son, Ty Iginla, who was their draft pick. They signed him to an entry-level contract. I'm sure he's going to go back and continue playing in junior. They lost J.J. Moser, Travis Dermott, and Josh Brown are all gone. How about the re-signs of Barrett Hayton and Curtis Douglas? They decided to re-sign them. So it's kind of a busy offseason.
Yeah, and I think it just blends in with all the excitement there, because this has been a franchise that has been a laughingstock really ever since it went to Arizona 28 years ago. 18 playoff misses in those 28 years. Only 2 playoff series wins. So I'm excited to see how this team is received, how they perform. I like a lot of what they did in terms of bolstering their defense. And I also like their forward group. And they're pretty strong in goal. I think Karel Vejmelka and Connor Ingram, a pretty decent 1-2. I would actually put them in the upper half of the NHL. And you got to remember, this team held firm for about 45 games last year. We're right in the thick of the playoff race before falling off. I believe this team is ready to take the next step.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised that they would. I'll put them in with St. Louis as a team that's going to be fighting to take one of those playoff spots away from somebody who had it last year. I think they seem to go downhill as soon as the rumor got out that they might be moving to Utah. Do you remember that? They really started to stumble after that. And I like they're a good young team. When they played in that little bandbox in Arizona, they surprised a lot of teams that came in. They had a good home record, so at Mullet Arena. Should be Barry Melrose's favorite arena, the Mullet Arena.
Sure should.
Anyway.
Chicago Blackhawks, 8th last season, 52 points, 4 straight playoff misses. A lot of key signings here. Tyler Bertuzzi comes in from Toronto. Teuvo Teravainen from Carolina. Laurent Brossoit from Winnipeg. Pat Maroon from Boston. Alec Martinez, who broke the hearts of Blackhawk fans with a Game 7 overtime goal in the 2014 Western Conference Finals. DJ Brody comes in from Toronto. And they get Ilya Mikheyev and Sam Lafferty in trades from Vancouver. To offset that, they do lose Taylor Radish, who signs with Washington. Nikita Zaitsev and Tyler Johnson also gone. But I believe this club is going to take a step forward this year. I think maybe they have now bottomed out, and it looks like they're looking to make a little bit of a push. I don't know if this is a playoff team yet, but I certainly think finally they're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, I don't think it's a playoff team, but I do think it's going to be a very improved team. I'm not sure if they'll be able to bang on the door of the playoffs. They might. Of course, a lot of it will depend on how is Bedard. Is he going to be this generational player in the NHL, or is he just going to be a good franchise? We know he's a franchise player because we saw him last year. They've really bolstered their lineup, and Luke Richardson will finally have something to work with under his tenure as head coach of Chicago. He hasn't really had much to work with in the time he's been there. They also signed Mrazek to 2 years at $4.25, and then they backed that up with your Winnipeg goaltender and Laurent Brossoit. So. They're covering their bases. It looks like they're a 2-goalie team, 1A and 1B, the way they're structuring this. And we'll see. I mean, it's going to be exciting for Blackhawk fans because they're going to get an improved team for sure. I think that Chicago has decided, okay, enough with competing for first overall pick in the entry draft every year.
And of course, now Bedard has a year under his belt. He did miss 14 games with that broken jaw, courtesy of Brendan Smith of the Devils last year. And also, let's not forget, Taylor Hall missed most of last season. He returns. He's supposed to be paired on a line with Athanasiou and Kurashev. So there's a little bit of depth on this team. And I just wanted to mention that their first pick from Michigan State, Artyom Levchinov, he was the top defenseman rated by Central Scouting. So last year, they got Bedard, the top forward. This year, they draft the top defenseman. So I think the future's looking up in the Windy City.
It is, and it'll be a long, it's a long road to hoe for sure when you're down that low as they've been. Chicago has been, but if they make the right signings, if we'll see how this team comes together, and they've got some veteran leadership, re-signing Foligno, bringing in Pat Maroon. A lot of people might sort of frown at them signing Pat Maroon, but he has been he's a Stanley Cup winner. I mean, he won 3 in a row.
3 in a row, yep.
St. Louis and Tampa. 2 with Tampa.
Yep.
And so, you know what? As I said earlier in this show, you can't have enough rings in your dressing room if you really want to compete.
This is the human side of the story, brought to you by the Game 7 Group. And we were talking about Peter DeBoer as part of this show. And DeBoer has an unbelievable record of 8-0 in Game 7s in the Stanley Cup playoffs. And let's face it, Game 7 has a magic attached to it like nothing in sport. In order to prevail, teamwork is essential to achieving success. At the Game 7 Group, transforming individuals into cohesive teams is the core philosophy in their team building approach. Their belief is every team has potential to achieve extraordinary results. Game 7 Group offers various services to help teams accomplish their goals through specific team building events, coaching, and speaking engagements. These services are aimed at improving team dynamics, productivity, and overall performance. There is no question that we all want to be able to succeed in the big moment. Check out the Game 7 Group website at game7group.com/NHL Wraparound to learn more. Right now, a special incentive offer awaits our podcast listeners. Take your team to the next step. The Game 7 Group will help get you there. And Neil, we're going to talk about a player that has just retired from the NHL, small player, big game guy.
Sure is. And that's Joe Pavelski, who is a Plover, Wisconsin native, born back in 1984, which means he's now this summer turned 40 years old. And I guess that went into his thinking. But Joe Pavelski, San Jose Sharks drafted him in the 7th round back in 2003. That's the last round of the entry draft. They drafted him out of Waterloo in the USHL, where he got 69 points in 60 games and went on from there to play at University of Wisconsin, had 2 excellent seasons. His second year at University of Wisconsin, 56 points in 43 games. He then went up the next year to the Sharks, went to training camp. The Sharks put him into Worcester, Massachusetts, where he got 26 points in 16 games. And they said, whoa, you're coming up here to the show. And they brought him up, and that started a long, long career of only 2 teams, San Jose Sharks, where he's mostly known for. And then later in his last 5 seasons, he played for the Dallas Stars, played a total of 1,332 games in the NHL, scoring 1,068 points. And for a guy drafted in the 7th round, 205th overall, like an afterthought, what an unbelievable career. It's a Hockey Hall of Fame career, without any doubt. I mean, there isn't a Stanley Cup in there because for the 2 teams he played for, San Jose Sharks and the Dallas Stars. But I don't know how Joe Pavelski could have done much more. He was a leader with each of those teams. and played hard night after night. As you said, he wasn't huge. He was about 6 foot. But his center of gravity was so good. He was so hard to knock off the puck. He had a way to keep the opponents away from the puck and be able to protect the puck so well. So just a great career coming to an end for a player that I think deserves Hall of Fame recognition.
And boy, this guy was as tough as nails also, because as you just mentioned, he wasn't big, but he would play in the dirty areas, and there were few players in the NHL that were better at deflecting pucks than Joe Pavelski. And oh, by the way, we mentioned Peter DeBoer at the head of this segment about being 8-0 in Game 7s. Pavelski, a record of 8-3, so not too shabby himself. So props to Joe Pavelski on a great career, and perhaps we see him in the Hall of Fame not too far down the road. That'll do it for this show. Thanks to the Game 7 group for sponsoring us today. Thank you to our listeners. Send questions or comments to nhlwraparound@gmail.com. And don't forget our website, nhlwraparound.com. All episodes available on both video and audio platforms. Our final summer cooler coming up when we hit the Pacific Division. On behalf of Neil, I'm Vic, and we will see you then.
Thanks for joining us on the NHL Wraparound podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on all the NHL action.